Welcome back to Nighttime History. Today we will be exploring the quiet world of the medieval monastery cellarer and the detailed work of managing wine, grain and salt through the long inventories conducted after compline. Thank you for joining us tonight. Sit back and relax as we dive deep into the stone corridors, vaulted storerooms and candlelit record keeping that sustained monastic communities across Europe from the 9th century through the 15th century. The position of cellarer within a medieval monastery represented one of the most demanding administrative roles in the entire community. Unlike the abbot, who oversaw spiritual matters and external relations, or the prior, who managed the daily rhythm of prayer and discipline, the cellarer bore responsibility for the physical sustenance of every soul within the enclosure. Documents from Benedictine houses across England, France, Germany and Italy indicate that cellarers typically managed vast stores of provisions, coordinated with external suppliers, negotiated purchases at market, and maintained meticulous records of every barrel, sack and jar under their care. The Rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed by countless monasteries throughout the medieval period, specified that the cellarer should be chosen for wisdom, mature character and temperate habits, someone who would treat the monastery's goods as sacred vessels of the altar. This comparison was not merely symbolic. The cellarer's storerooms held the material foundation of the community's ability to pray, study, offer hospitality and care for the sick and poor. Inventories conducted by cellarers typically occurred at regular intervals throughout the monastic year. Many houses performed major stock assessments quarterly, aligning these reviews with the changing agricultural seasons and the major liturgical feasts. Smaller weekly or even nightly checks ensured that no spoilage went unnoticed, that consumption remained within expected bounds, and that emergency shortages could be identified before they became crises. The night hours after compline, the final communal prayer service that concluded around 8 or 9 in the evening, offered cellarers the quiet and solitude necessary for this detailed work. With the community retired to the dormitory, and silence imposed throughout the enclosure, the cellarer could move through storerooms without interruption, accompanied only by a junior monk or lay brother trained to assist with lifting heavy sacks and recording figures on wax tablets. The tools employed during these inventory nights were simple but effective. Wax tablets consisting of wooden frames filled with beeswax that could be inscribed with a stylus and then smoothed for reuse, served as the primary medium for temporary notes. Cellarers would mark initial counts and observations on these tablets as they moved from room to room, then transfer final figures to parchment ledgers the following day. Keys hung from the cellarer's belt, each one corresponding to a specific storeroom, barrel cupboard, or locked chest. These keys represented both practical necessity and symbolic authority. In many houses, the ceremony of handing over the keys marked the formal transfer of the cellarer's office from one monk to another. The weight of iron keys, some as long as a handspan, served as a constant physical reminder of the trust placed in the office holder. Wine occupied a central place in monastic provisions, both for liturgical use and daily consumption. Monasteries throughout wine-producing regions maintained extensive cellars, often vaulted chambers built partially or entirely below ground, to maintain cool, stable temperatures year-round. Records from Cluny, one of the most influential Benedictine houses, indicate that the community there consumed thousands of litres annually. Each monk typically received a daily ration, the amount varying by season, feast days and local custom, The cellarer needed to balance immediate consumption against long-term storage, understanding which barrels contained young wine for everyday use and which held reserve stocks intended to age for years. The process of checking wine stores began with visual and olfactory inspection. Approaching each barrel, the cellarer would first examine the exterior for any signs of leakage, warping, or damage to the iron hoops that held the staves in place. Wooden barrels, crafted by co-opers who specialized in this essential trade, required regular maintenance. Dry conditions could cause wood to shrink, creating gaps that allowed wine to seep out or air to seep in. Excessive moisture could encourage mold or rot. The cellarer looked for telltale dark stains on the stone floor beneath barrels, indicators of slow leaks that might waste precious stores. After visual inspection came the careful removal of the bung, the wooden stopper that sealed the barrel's opening. This moment required attention and a certain practiced caution. Gas could build up inside fermenting or aging wine, and removing a bung too quickly might result in spray or overflow. The cellarer would typically loosen the bung gradually, listening for the hiss of escaping air, then withdraw it completely and lean close to smell the wine's bouquet. Trained cellarers could identify spoilage, excessive oxidation, or the vinegary tang of wine turning to acetic acid simply by scent. A healthy wine, whether red or white, would smell of fruit, earth, and the particular character of its grape and terroir. Any hint of mustiness, sharpness, or decay required immediate investigation. Measuring the volume remaining in each barrel involved either dipping a marked rod into the liquid or, for smaller vessels, pouring the contents into standardized containers. Many monasteries used specific measures, often derived from local or regional standards, but sometimes unique to the house itself. A tun might contain 250 gallons, a pipe half that amount, a hogshead 63 gallons. The cellarer needed to maintain conversion knowledge, understanding how these traditional measures related to one another and to the monastery's daily need. If a barrel held approximately 40 gallons and the community of 60 monks each received a half pint daily, simple calculation revealed how many days that barrel would last under normal circumstances. Feast days, when rations increased, or periods of fasting, when consumption decreased, complicated these projections. Recording each barrel's contents, location, and condition occupied significant time. The assistant would hold the wax tablet steady while the cellarer dictated figures and notes. Room 3, barrel 7, red wine from the southern vineyard, 3/4 full, good condition, bung secure. Room 3, barrel 8, white wine from the eastern slope, half full, slight sourness detected, recommend consumption within 2 weeks before further decline. These notations, made by stylus scratches in soft wax, would be transcribed later into the permanent parchment register, but the immediate record allowed the cellarer to track patterns, identify problems, and plan the next day's distributions. Salt constituted another crucial commodity under the cellarer's supervision, perhaps less obvious than wine or grain, but equally essential to monastic life. Before modern refrigeration, salt served as the primary preservative for meat, fish, cheese, and certain vegetables. Monasteries located near coastal regions or salt mines might produce their own supply through evaporation or mining, but many houses purchased salt from travelling merchants or at regional fairs. The cost of salt fluctuated based on distance from source, quality, and political disruptions to trade routes. Fine white salt, carefully refined and free of impurities, commanded premium prices and was often reserved for the abbot's table and honoured guests. Coarser grey or brown salt, less expensive but equally effective for preservation, served the general community's needs. Salt was typically stored in sealed ceramic jars, wooden casks lined with wax or resin, or occasionally in dedicated salt rooms with stone floors and walls designed to stay dry. Moisture represented salt's greatest enemy in storage. Damp conditions could cause salt to cake into solid masses, making it difficult to measure and use. More seriously, moisture could dissolve salt, leading to losses and potential contamination of other stores if brine seeped through flooring. The cellarer inspected salt containers carefully, checking seals, testing for dampness, and sometimes transferring salt from compromised containers into sound ones during inventory nights. Measuring salt involved scooping from jars into standardized vessels, often simple wooden or ceramic measures corresponding to specific volumes. A monastery's salt consumption varied considerably based on the season and the preservation work underway. Autumn, when pigs were slaughtered and pork needed curing for winter, demanded enormous quantities. Spring and summer, when fresh foods were more available, required less. The cellarer needed to project these seasonal variations, ensuring adequate supply during peak demand while avoiding the expense of maintaining excessive reserves that tied up capital and storage space. The sensory qualities of salt checking created their own particular atmosphere during inventory nights. The scrape of a scoop against the interior of a ceramic jar produced a distinctive gritty whisper. Salt poured from one container to another made a sound like distant surf, a soft rushing that filled the quiet storeroom. Fine salt felt almost silky between the fingers, while coarse salt had a rough, crystalline texture. The cellarer might taste a pinch from each container, not for pleasure, but to verify quality and detect any contamination or adulteration. Pure salt tasted intensely saline and nothing else. Any bitterness, sweetness, or off flavours indicated problems either from impurities in the original product or from contamination during storage. Grain stores represented perhaps the most voluminous and complex aspect of the cellarer's responsibility. Medieval monasteries required grain for multiple purposes beyond simple bread making. Wheat, barley, rye, oats, and sometimes more specialized grains like spelt, each served different functions. Wheat flour produced the finest bread and the communion wafers essential for the Eucharist. Barley went into brewing ale or beer, the standard daily beverage in regions where water quality was uncertain. Oats fed horses and occasionally supplemented human diet, particularly in northern regions. Rye provided a hardier, cheaper alternative to wheat in areas with poor soil or harsh climates. The cellarer needed to maintain appropriate quantities of each type, understanding their different storage requirements, vulnerability to pests, and rates of consumption. Grain was stored in large wooden chests, dedicated granary buildings with raised floors to prevent moisture and rodent access, or sometimes in sealed ceramic vessels for valuable seed grain. The organisation of grain storage reflected both practical concerns and the monastery's economic circumstances. Wealthy houses might maintain separate buildings for each grain type, with sophisticated ventilation systems and regular turning of stocks to prevent spoilage. More modest communities stored different grains in sections of a single room, relying on careful record keeping and regular inspection to maintain order. The process of inventorying grain began with approaching each storage container and removing its lid or opening its door. The cellarer would peer inside, sometimes holding a candle or oil lamp carefully to illuminate the interior without risking fire. The top surface of stored grain revealed immediate information. Grain in good condition showed a relatively even surface, perhaps slightly settled but without obvious disturbance. Irregular depressions, tunnels, or scattered chaff indicated rodent activity. A greyish, dusty coating suggested mould growth. Small, dark specks moving across the surface meant weevil or other insect infestation. Reaching into the grain, the cellarer would pull up handfuls from different depths, examining the kernels closely. Healthy grain felt dry and firm, with a clean, earthy smell. Each kernel should be plump and intact. Shriveled or discoloured kernels indicated age or poor storage conditions. A musty or sour smell revealed the beginning of rot, often caused by grain stored while still too damp from harvest. The cellarer might crack a few kernels between teeth or fingers, testing for the right degree of hardness and the absence of interior decay. Measuring grain volume required more labour than wine or salt. Grain was scooped from storage containers into standardized bushel baskets or smaller measures, counted and recorded. A bushel, roughly 8 gallons in volume, though varying somewhat by region and period, served as the standard grain measure throughout medieval Europe. Large monasteries might store hundreds or thousands of bushels, requiring hours of counting during major inventories. The cellarer and assistant would work methodically, calling out numbers, marking tallies on the wax tablet, occasionally pausing to rest arms tired from lifting and pouring. We hope you are enjoying this journey into the medieval monastery cellarer's world. If you are finding value in this content, we invite you to join our community of nighttime travellers by subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications so you never miss our historical explorations. Please like this video to support our work and help others discover these quiet corners of the past. Let us know in the comments where you are settling in to sleep tonight and what time it is in your part of the world as you listen to these ancient routines and records. The rhythm of inventory work followed a particular pattern throughout the night. The cellarer would move systematically through the storage complex, typically beginning with the most valuable or vulnerable items and progressing through the stocks in a logical order determined by the building's layout. Wine cellars, grain stores, and salt rooms might be scattered across the monastery grounds or concentrated in a single service area near the kitchen and refectory. Each location required the cellarer to unlock doors, conduct inspections, record findings, secure containers, and move to the next area. The footsteps echoed differently in different spaces. Stone corridors produced sharp, clear sounds. Wooden floors in granaries created softer, more muffled impacts. The vaulted wine cellars sometimes generated slight echoes that made a single person's movement sound like 2 or 3. Temperature and humidity awareness formed a crucial part of the cellarer's expertise. Different storage environments suited different products. Wine preferred cool, stable conditions without dramatic temperature swings. Grain needed to stay dry above all else, even if that meant slightly warmer storage in upper rooms with good air circulation. Salt required dry conditions as well, but could tolerate a wider temperature range than grain. The cellarer learned to read the subtle signs of environmental conditions, noticing condensation on stone walls that indicated rising humidity, feeling the temperature difference between rooms, observing how quickly candlelight flickered in drafts that might bring moisture or excessive ventilation. Seasonal variations affected storage conditions significantly. Winter brought cold that could benefit wine aging, but might allow grain moisture to freeze and damage kernels. Summer heat could accelerate wine oxidation and encourage insect activity in grain, Spring dampness from melting snow and rain posed mold risks. Autumn's temperature fluctuations as the weather shifted from warm to cold created condensation problems. The cellarer adjusted storage strategies throughout the year, sometimes moving particularly vulnerable stocks to better locations, increasing the frequency of inspections during problematic seasons, or treating containers with additional sealants during damp periods. Pest control represented an ongoing concern in any monastery storage areas. Rats and mice sought grain with persistent determination. Weevils, moths, and other insects laid eggs in stored products that hatched into larvae, consuming the provisions from within. Monasteries employed various strategies to combat these threats. Cats, though not mentioned in most monastic rules, were often tolerated or even quietly encouraged in storage areas. Some houses used herbs believed to repel insects, scattering lavender, mint, or wormwood among grain sacks. Others relied on physical barriers, storing grain in sealed containers raised on stone or metal platforms that rodents could not easily climb. The cellarer's nighttime rounds included watching for signs of pest activity, listening for the sounds of gnawing or rustling that indicated unwelcome visitors, and examining floors and corners for droppings or other evidence. The documentation system used by monastic cellarers evolved over the medieval centuries, becoming increasingly sophisticated as literacy spread and accounting practices developed. Early medieval inventories might consist of simple lists, noting only basic quantities and types. By the high medieval period, many monasteries maintained elaborate ledgers with separate columns for different categories of information. The date of inspection, the location of each item, its quantity, its condition, its source. The date of acquisition, the projected depletion date, and notes about quality or concerns might all be recorded. These registers served multiple purposes beyond immediate inventory control. They provided evidence for planning future purchases, documentation for audits by visiting abbots or bishops, historical records that allowed analysis of consumption patterns over years or decades, and legal proof of the monastery's assets in disputes over property or taxation. The physical act of writing on parchment differed substantially from making quick marks on wax tablets. Parchment, made from specially prepared animal skin, was expensive and valuable. Scribes, including cellarers when they performed their own record-keeping, treated it with care. The preparation of ink from oak galls, iron salts and gum arabic produced a dark, permanent medium that required skill to use well. Quill pens, cut from goose or swan feathers, needed regular sharpening and proper angle and pressure to create clear, even letters. The cellarer who transcribed inventory notes from wax tablet to parchment ledger typically worked at a writing desk in a scriptorium, office, or private chamber rather than in the storerooms themselves. This transcription might occur the morning after an inventory night, when daylight and the settled atmosphere of the day provided better conditions for careful penmanship. The community's dependence on the cellarer's work created a significant burden of responsibility. Any error in calculation could lead to shortages that left the community hungry. Failure to detect spoilage early enough might waste valuable resources. Poor negotiation with merchants could drain the monastery's finances. Over-purchasing could tie up funds needed for other expenses. Under-purchasing might leave the community vulnerable to supply disruptions. The cellarer walked a constant line between caution and boldness, between thrift and adequacy. The rule of Benedict specifically instructed that the cellarer should provide requested items without delay or harsh words, understanding that scarcity and administrative friction could disturb the community's peace and focus. Different monastic orders and individual houses developed varying approaches to the cellarer's role. In small communities, the cellarer might work almost entirely alone, perhaps with assistance from one or two others during the busiest times. Large monasteries sometimes developed elaborate hierarchies beneath the cellarer, with sub-cellarers responsible for specific categories such as the wine cellarer, the grain cellarer, and the cellarer of the infirmary who managed supplies for sick monks. These subordinate officials conducted their own inventories and reported to the chief cellarer, who synthesized information and maintained overall control. The largest and wealthiest houses might employ lay brothers or even hired staff to perform manual labor in storerooms, freeing the cellarer to focus on administration, planning, and coordination. The relationship between the cellarer and other monastic officials required careful navigation. The abbot theoretically held ultimate authority over all monastery resources, but practical administration typically rested with the cellarer, who possessed the detailed knowledge necessary for daily decisions. The prior, responsible for discipline and the order of community life, needed to coordinate with the cellarer to ensure that provisions supported rather than disrupted the horarium. The daily schedule of prayer and work. The almoner, who distributed charity to the poor at the monastery gate, drew on the cellarer's stores and needed to balance generous giving against the community's own needs. The kitchener, who supervised food preparation, worked directly with the cellarer to obtain ingredients and plan meals. These interlocking responsibilities meant that the cellarer operated within a web of relationships requiring tact, clear communication, and sometimes negotiation or compromise. Trade connections extended the cellarer's responsibilities beyond the monastery walls. Most houses could not produce everything they needed within their own lands. Wine monasteries in grain-growing regions had to purchase wine from elsewhere. Grain-producing houses might need to buy wine. Salt almost always came from external sources, unless the monastery happened to sit near coastal saltworks or underground deposits. The cellarer developed relationships with merchants, attending markets and fairs, negotiating contracts, evaluating quality, and arranging transport. These external interactions required the cellarer to understand market conditions, recognize fair prices, detect fraud or deception, and represent the monastery's interests effectively in a commercial environment quite different from the quiet cloister. Transport logistics added another layer of complexity. Wine travelled in barrels that needed careful handling to avoid damage and spoilage. Grain moved in sacks that had to be kept dry and secure against theft or spillage. Salt might be packed in smaller containers suitable for loading onto pack animals or carts. The cellarer coordinated with carters, bargemen, or the monastery's own transport resources to move goods from points of purchase to the monastery stores. Distance, road conditions, weather, and security concerns all affected these arrangements. A monastery in a remote mountain location faced different challenges than one situated on a navigable river or near a major road. Seasonal rhythms shaped the cellarer's work throughout the year. Autumn brought the grain harvest, requiring the cellarer to inspect incoming loads, verify quantities against what had been promised or purchased, test quality, and organize storage. The grape harvest followed, with wine-producing monasteries transforming into centers of intense activity as fruit was crushed, juice was set to ferment, and new wine was barreled. Winter slowed agricultural activity, but increased consumption as cold weather drove the community indoors, and feast days multiplied around Christmas and Epiphany. Spring meant checking over winter stores, identifying what remained, projecting whether supplies would last until the next harvest, and planning purchases if shortages loomed. Summer brought fresh foods that reduced dependence on stored provisions, but also required the cellarer to begin preparing for the coming autumn's storage work, ensuring that containers were clean and ready, that storage spaces were in good repair, and that advance arrangements were made with suppliers. Financial records kept by cellarers provide historians with invaluable evidence about medieval economic life. Prices paid for wine, grain, and salt, recorded in monastery ledgers, help reconstruct market conditions and trace economic changes over time. The quantities purchased and consumed reveal information about community size, living standards, and the impact of events like plague, war, or famine. Periodic surpluses or shortages visible in inventory records often correlate with known historical events, confirming or complicating narratives derived from chronicles and other literary sources. The cellarer's detailed practical documentation thus serves purposes far beyond its original intent, offering modern researchers a window into the material reality of medieval life. The tools and containers used in storage evolved during the medieval period as crafts developed and trade expanded. Early medieval barrels were relatively crude, sometimes prone to leakage and requiring frequent repairs. By the high medieval period, co-opers had refined their techniques to produce remarkably tight, durable containers. Ceramic vessels similarly improved, with better understanding of firing temperatures and glazing techniques, producing jars that sealed more effectively and resisted breakage. Iron hoops replaced earlier wooden bindings on many barrels, providing stronger reinforcement. These technological incremental improvements made the cellarer's work somewhat easier and reduced losses to spoilage and breakage, though the fundamental tasks remained essentially unchanged. Monastic customaries, books that recorded the specific practices of individual houses or orders, sometimes included detailed instructions for cellarers. These texts reveal the accumulated wisdom of generations of administrators. They specify how often inventory should occur, what records should be kept, how to identify common problems, appropriate responses to shortages or surpluses, and the proper relationship between the cellarer and other officials. Reading these custommaries provides insight into how monasteries conceived of the cellarer's role, what qualities they valued, and what errors they particularly wanted to avoid. Some customers display remarkable sophistication in their understanding of storage chemistry, pest behavior, and economic planning, even if they explained these matters in religious rather than scientific terms. The spiritual dimension of the cellarer's work deserves attention. Medieval monks understood physical labor and administrative duties as forms of prayer, opportunities to serve God through service to the community. The cellarer who carefully tended stores, prevented waste, and ensured adequate provisions enabled the community's primary purpose of prayer and worship. The connection was not merely instrumental. The care given to barrels of wine or sacks of grain reflected the same reverence theoretically applied to sacred vessels and liturgical objects. The patient, detail-oriented work of inventory connected to the monastic values of humility, obedience, and stewardship. The cellarer who stayed awake through the quiet hours after complying, moving through dark storerooms with a lamp, checking and recording and securing the community's material foundation, participated in a tradition that stretched back centuries and extended forward to unknown generations who would perform the same essential tasks. The sensory environment of inventory nights created a distinctive experience. The cool air of underground cellars or well-ventilated granaries, the smell of wine mingling with grain dust, and the mineral tang of salt, the play of lamplight across stone walls and wooden beams, the silence broken only by footsteps and the sounds of containers being opened and closed, all combined to create an atmosphere of focused concentration. The cellarer developed intimate familiarity with these spaces, knowing without thought where each barrel stood, which floor stones were uneven, where cobwebs tended to gather, how the light fell at different times of night depending on the lamp's position. Health and safety concerns affected storage practices in ways that medieval people understood imperfectly, but responded to nonetheless. Grain dust in poorly ventilated spaces could make breathing difficult. Heavy lifting risked injury, particularly for older monks or those in poor health. Damp storage areas encouraged respiratory ailments. Fire represented a constant danger whenever lamps or candles were used near stored goods, especially grain, which could produce explosive dust in certain concentrations. The cellarer learned caution, moved deliberately rather than hastily, ensured adequate ventilation before entering closed spaces, and used fire sources with careful attention to their placement and security. The relationship between stored provisions and the monastery's wider economic activities created important connections. Some monasteries were primarily self-sufficient, producing most of what they consumed on their own lands. Others participated actively in commercial markets, selling surplus wine, grain, or other products to finance purchases and building projects. The cellarer's inventory records helped determine when surpluses existed that could safely be sold without risking the community's needs. These commercial decisions sometimes generated tension between economic opportunity and monastic values of detachment from worldly concerns. Different orders and houses resolved these tensions differently, with some embracing commercial activity as a means of supporting charity and building works, while others restricted external trade and emphasized self-sufficiency and simplicity. Quality standards varied considerably based on context and intended use. The finest wine, made from the best grapes and stored most carefully, might be reserved for the abbot's table, honoured guests, and the most important liturgical celebrations. More ordinary wine served daily community needs. Vinegary wine beginning to spoil might still be used in cooking or distributed to the poor rather than wasted entirely. Similarly, grain was often graded, with the cleanest, most uniform wheat going to make communion wafers and bread for the altar, while mixed grain or lower grades served for everyday bread or animal feed. Salt ranged from pure white crystals for the finest uses to coarse mineral-heavy varieties for basic preservation. The cellarer managed these quality distinctions, ensuring that each level of provision went to appropriate uses. Regional variations in storage practices reflected climate, available materials, and local traditions. Mediterranean monasteries dealt with heat and aridity, requiring different strategies than northern European houses facing cold and damp. Regions with ready access to stone-built, elaborate, vaulted cellars that maintained stable, cool conditions, ideal for wine. Areas dominated by timber construction used different techniques, sometimes building storehouses on stilts to improve ventilation and prevent ground moisture from affecting stores. These regional differences meant that a cellarer transferring from one monastery to another might need to learn new methods and adapt to unfamiliar conditions, even though the fundamental goals remained the same. The progression of inventory night followed the earlier established pattern of methodical movement through storage areas, checking, measuring, recording, securing, and advancing to the next location. The repetitive nature of the work created a meditative quality, a rhythm that allowed the mind to settle into calm focus, while hands and eyes performed practice tasks. For the medieval monk serving as cellarer, this combination of physical activity, mental concentration, and solitary quiet fit naturally into the broader pattern of monastic life, which sought to sanctify all hours and activities through mindful attention and dedication to communal welfare. Barrel construction details mattered significantly for wine storage. Oak was preferred in many regions for its strength, slight porosity that allowed beneficial micro-oxygenation, and the subtle flavours it could impart to wine. Chestnut served similar purposes in areas where oak was scarce. The cooper's skill in selecting wood, shaping staves, fitting them together, and securing them with hoops directly affected how well barrels would preserve their contents. The cellarer developed working relationships with co-opers, commissioning new barrels as needed, requesting repairs for damaged ones, and sometimes supervising the assembly process to ensure quality standards were met. The monastery's relationship with its agricultural lands and tenants created the foundation for much of what the cellarer managed. Grain came from fields worked by peasant farmers who owed rents and labour services to the monastery. Wine came from vineyards similarly held as monastic property. The cellarer received reports from the monastery's estate managers about expected harvest yields, which informed planning and purchase decisions. Poor harvest years required the cellarer to purchase more from external markets or dip into reserves. Abundant harvests allowed the building of reserves or sale of surpluses. This connection between the cellarer's storerooms and the broader landscape of monastic landholding, agricultural production, and feudal relationships embedded the inventory work in larger economic and social systems. Thank you for spending this time with us exploring the detailed world of the medieval monastery cellarer and the careful work of managing wine, grain, and salt through those quiet inventory nights. If you enjoyed this journey through history and are still awake, we invite you to check out our other medieval content about daily life, crafts, and the rhythms that shaped centuries past. And if you have fallen asleep, please relax and enjoy the rain.